Hello and welcome to this journey into the mysteries of history. Tonight we travel deep into the jungles of Central America, where beneath the thick green canopy lie vast forgotten cities. Their plazas once alive with ceremony now stand, silent, their stairways tangled with vines, their temples split apart by the roots of ancient trees. Each stone is a monument to a people who rose to astonishing heights before fading into silence. We know them as the Maya, and their golden age is remembered as the Classic Era. They created the most sophisticated writing system in the ancient Americas and mastered mathematics that reached into the infinite and charted the heavens with such patience that they could predict eclipses centuries before they came. Their world was not a single empire with one crown, but a shifting constellation of city-states, each ruled by its own divine lord. Great centers such as Tikal Palenque, Copan, and the mighty Calakmul rose and fell in rivalry, weaving alliances through royal marriages and unraveling them in sudden wars. Every monument carved in stone records this restless dance of ambition. Every relief bears witness to triumph and betrayal. At the heart of this world stood one plant maze. It was more than food, it was life itself. It shaped their myths, their rituals, their identity. They called themselves the people of corn. To nurture it in the fragile soils of the rainforest demanded brilliance. They cleared small plots in the forest, carved terraces into hillsides, and raised fertile beds in swamps. The cycle of planting, growth, and harvest was never just survival. It was the sacred drama that defined their universe. And at the very center of this sacred drama stood the king, both priest and shaman, as well as ruler. His highest duty was not to govern in the way we imagine today, but to hold the cosmos in balance. He did so by offering the most precious gift, his own blood. With blades of obsidian or the spines of stingrays, he pierced his flesh and let the drops fall onto strips of bark paper, which were then burned. In the rising smoke, the people believed a visioned serpent appeared, opening a pathway to gods and ancestors. The covenant was simple. The people gave their labor and their corn to the king, and the king fed the gods with his body. As long as this exchange endured, the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the world would remain in harmony. If you enjoy uncovering the echoes of lost civilizations, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from and what part of the story captures your imagination. Their cities reflected this faith. Towering pyramids cut into the sky, aligned with celestial events. Palaces carried stucco carvings of warriors and kings. Ball courts rang with the sounds of ritual games. Their scribes filled walls and stelae with glyphs that were both language and art. Their numbers were dots and lines, arranged with a symbol of genius, the concept of nothingness, zero. With it, they could calculate across immense spans of time. Their calendars turned like interlocking gears, the ritual. The count of 260 days, the solar count of 365 days, and the great long count that stretched back to the dawn of creation. In their eyes, time was not a line, but a cycle, a sacred wheel. Standing in those plazas centuries ago, a visitor would have felt the weight of eternity. The chants of priests, the beat of drums, the glow of torches against stone murals, all declared a world secure in its own order. Yet beneath the magnificence was fragility. Everything depended on the soil, on the rains, on the belief that kings could bend the heavens to their will. That fragility would one day open a crack through which the silence would pour. Beneath the canopy of the rainforest, the stones tell a story not with voices, but with carvings that once seemed like decoration. Scholars stared at them for decades, and saw only pictures of gods and strange creatures. They thought the true story of the Maya was gone forever. Yet hidden in the intricate curves and lines was a language unlike any other. The Maya script was not a simple alphabet. It was a tapestry of glyphs, some representing whole words, others breaking sounds into syllables. Scribes could spell the same word in many ways, combining art and sound into blocks arranged like woven fabric. The writing ran in paired columns, read across and down like a serpent winding its way over the page. For centuries it seemed impenetrable, but it was there waiting. The script was tied to mathematics, a system that did not stop at 10 like the Roman numerals of Europe, but reached higher through a base of 20. A dot meant 1, a line meant 5, and the empty shell of a snail meant nothing, yet nothing. There was everything. The shell was the invention of zero, a concept many great civilizations never reached. With it, the Maya could count into the millions. They could anchor their history in cycles of unimaginable length. They could carve on stone the date of a coronation, the story of a war, the death of a king, with an accuracy that would not be rivaled for 1,000 years. For the Maya, time was a sacred obsession. They did not see it as a straight road, but as circles within circles. The sacred calendar of 260 days turned, with the solar year of 365 days. Together, they formed a greater cycle, like gears grinding against one another. Every 52 years, the two calendars aligned like the reset of a cosmic clock. To keep records across centuries, they used the long count, a line of days that reached back to the birth of the world itself. Carved in their mythology at the start of the fourth creation, the dates on their monuments were not vague. They were precise. They marked the reigns of rulers, the rise of cities, the victories of battles. Their gaze turned to the heavens. From the tops of pyramids, priests watched the sun rise at exact points on the horizon. The moon and its eclipses were tracked with astonishing accuracy. The bright planet Venus was their warrior star, its cycles tied to omens of war. When Venus rose at dawn, kings prepared their armies, believing the gods had given a signal. The universe to them was not chaos, but a machine of perfect order. Their purpose was to read that machine and align their perfection, society, with its rhythm. Through ritual, sacrifice, and careful record. At the height of their golden age, the cities seemed eternal. Tikal with its towers, Calakmul with its vast reach, Copan with its artistry, all flourished. The calendars promised order, the rituals promised balance, the kings promised reign. Yet in the silence of the future, we know those promises would soon be broken. For now, though, in that age of brilliance, the Maya believed their world was unshakable. In the plazas of the great cities, the monuments stood tall. Each one was a public voice carved in stone, a record of a king's reign and his claim to divine power. For centuries, these stelae multiplied across the Maya lands, recording alliances, wars, victories, and the bloodline of rulers. Then, in the late 8th century, that voice began to falter. At Palenque, the final dated monument marks the end of the 8th century. Stone speaks before the 9th century closed. Then there is silence. The habit of recording triumphs ended abruptly, as if the kings no longer had victories to boast of, or perhaps no longer had the strength to command stone carvers to speak for them. The silence did not fall in a single night, but it spread like a shadow. One city after another stopped building new temples, causeways, and palaces. Excavations show half-finished plazas, blocks of stone abandoned on the roads, tools left behind, as if workers walked away in mid-strike. The engine that had driven this civilization seemed to grind to a halt. Where once there had been confidence and grandeur, there was now hesitation, unfinished projects, and decay. At the same time, the very layout of the cities began to change. The open plazas and soaring temples that had proclaimed power now sat behind crude, hastily built fortifications. Walls and ditches rose around royal compounds, a sign of fear that had never before marked Maya architecture. Within these walls, archaeologists find the remains of hurried construction, poor quality pottery, and jade trinkets that lack the mastery of earlier generations. The trade networks that once carried obsidian, salt, and fine ceramics across the lowlands were breaking down. The story written in these ruins is not uniform. Across the wide land, some places faltered, while others still grew. In the northern Yucatan, new centers like Chichen Itza began to thrive with fresh styles of art and new patterns of power. Yet, in the southern lowlands, the old heart of the classic age, the silence deepened. Families abandoned homes, rulers lost their authority. The proud stelae that had told their histories fell into ruin. The great question that haunted generations of scholars rose from this silence. Why did they leave? Why did cities that had thrived for centuries simply empty out? The answer would come slowly from the ground itself, from bones buried beneath. Palaces from murals painted in blood red, from layers of mud at the bottom of lakes. All of them whispering that a storm of crises was gathering. On the painted walls of temples, the scenes began to change. In the earlier centuries, they showed kings in elaborate regalia, capturing rival lords in ritualized contests. These images spoke of prestige, of theatre of warfare, contained within rules. But in the last generations, the art grew darker. At Bonampak, murals revealed armies clashing in chaos, warriors dressed as jaguars, hurling spears, captives lined in rows, their fingernails torn away before sacrifice. The formality was gone. What replaced it was terror. The earth confirms what the paintings suggest. Excavations at sites once known for open plazas and now reveal desperate defensive works. Ditches and walls thrown up in haste, mass graves filled with skeletons marked by wounds and trauma, tell of battles where whole groups perished. Not just captured nobles, entire regions like Dos Pilas spiraled into endless conflict. A dynasty that once sought expansion found its ambition turned against itself. The wars multiplied until the city was abandoned so suddenly that meals lay unfinished on tables and valuables remained on floors. This was no longer the controlled contest of kings vying for captives. It was total war and a consuming fire that spread from city to city. Farmers could not tend fields while soldiers marched. Trade routes collapsed under raids and ambushes. Faith in rulers faltered as kings failed to protect their people. The covenant between king and god frayed as hunger and fear grew. The very system that had bound the Maya world together for centuries was tearing itself apart. Yet war was only one part of the unraveling. Beneath the canopy, the soil itself was giving way to feed tens of thousands. Entire forests were cleared for fields and to create the gleaming plaster that coated pyramids. The cost of one temple could be measured in acres of lost trees. Without roots to hold it, the soil washed away with each rainstorm. The once fertile land turned to dust. The forests that had sheltered game and provided wood vanished. Entire hillsides lay bare beneath the sun. In the sediment of ancient lakes, scientists read the pollen of the past. They see the decline of tree species and the rise of weeds. They see thick layers of eroded soil washed down from denuded slopes. The very success of the Maya there, the hunger for monumental cities and swelling populations, was cutting away the foundation they depended on. Their triumphs were becoming the seeds of their ruin. The combination was deadly. Endless war pulled people from the fields, just as the land itself grew thin and barren. The people were trapped between enemies without and hunger within. The classic Maya world was entering its age of fear, a fragile structure trembling before the final blow that would come from the sky. The covenant of the Maya world was bound to the rain. From the first planting to the harvest, every ritual, every drop of royal blood spilled on bark paper was an appeal for water. The reservoirs carved with such care were the lifeblood of their cities, and the gods of maize were believed to answer the prayers of kings. For centuries, the sky provided. Then in the heart of the classic age, the clouds withdrew. The evidence does not lie in myth, but in stone and earth. In the stalagmites of vast caves, each thin layer of mineral holds the signature of the water that fell in ages past. When scientists measured those layers, they uncovered a story of skies that grew silent. In the sediments of lakes, gypsum crystals marked the seasons of dryness. The records told the same tale, a long, slow disaster, beginning as the cities reached their height. A drought, not of one season, but of generations. A span of centuries, marked by failures of rain and by waves of even deeper catastrophes, when the sky withheld water for decades at a time. For a people whose kings claimed to command the heavens, this was not merely a hardship, it was the breaking of a sacred promise. The great reservoirs shrank into cracked mud. The maize fields withered. Families stared at stalks that yielded nothing. Children grew thin and weak. Hunger stalked the plazas where once feasts had been held. Even the jungle itself began to dry. Sacred cenotes, once thought eternal, sank into emptiness. The kings responded as they always had, with more blood, more prayers, more desperate ceremonies. They cut their flesh and burned offerings until smoke filled the sky. But the clouds did not return. With every failed ritual, faith waned. The people looked at their rulers and saw men, not gods. They looked at the temples and saw stone that could not feed them. The covenant was broken, and when the bond between ruler and subject dissolved, the cities had nothing left to hold them together. The drought alone did not shatter the Maya world. The warfare and the destruction of the forests had already weakened them. But the silence of the skies was the final weight that bent the structure until it broke. It was not one city who fell, but many, each emptying, as families abandoned the plazas and vanished into the forest, searching for survival elsewhere. The collapse was not a single fiery end, but a long exodus, a retreat from grandeur into survival. Archaeologists imagine a family in Tikal watching their last store of maize dwindle. The reservoirs are dust. The king offers only promises. The enemy waits beyond the walls, and hunger gnaws within. So they gather what little they can carry, and in the darkness of night they slip away. Their footsteps are joined by thousands, and soon the roar of the jungle replaces the chants of priests. The city that had stood for centuries falls silent, not with an explosion, but with a whisper. When the people abandoned the plazas, the jungle began its patient work of reclamation. The first winds carried seeds into cracks between paving stones. Small shoots broke apart, plaster floors creeping through the courts, where games had once echoed. With each passing year, the roots of ceiba and ramon trees widened, the fractures pushing blocks of stone aside until stairways split and walls toppled. Temples that had risen like mountains became green hills, crowned with tangled branches. The transformation was not violent, but relentless. Markets that once rang with the voices of traders filled with the buzz of insects. Ball courts where thousands had watched. The ritual game turned into silent clearings, shaded by vines. The Murals of kings and gods faded beneath moisture and lichen. The jungle swallowed everything in slow silence, erasing human order with the persistence of time. For nearly 1,000 years, the great southern cities lay hidden. Generations of Maya descendants lived in smaller villages, tending modest fields, preserving their language, their weaving, their stories. They remembered their ancestors, not with towering pyramids, but with oral tales and humble rituals. The outside world, however, forgot. For foreign scholars, the jungle hid not only the ruins, but the very idea that such a civilization had ever thrived.
This is a beautiful gathering.
Then the silence was broken by explorers of another age. In the 19th century, Stevens and Catherwood hacked their way through thickets and stood awestruck before monuments no European had believed possible. Their drawings and books proved that these were not fantasies, but the legacy of an indigenous people. Every illustration, every page, was a challenge to prejudice. The world at last acknowledged that in these forests, a civilization as advanced as Greece or Egypt had once flourished. Yet recognition only deepened the mystery. Who were these people? How had they risen to such heights, and why had they abandoned their shining cities? The ruins whispered but did not answer. The glyphs covering the walls and stelae remained, silent, undeciphered. Their meaning was debated, dismissed, and misunderstood. For decades, the city stayed mute, beautiful, and unknowable. The descendants of the Maya still walked the land, but the voice of their ancestors seemed lost. The silence of the script, the silence of the abandoned temples, the silence of the jungle itself, all joined in a haunting chorus. The world now, I knew the cities existed, but the true story of their builders still slept beneath stone and leaf. For almost a century after the rediscovery, the monuments stood like puzzles carved in stone. The glyphs were admired as works of art, elaborate designs of jaguars, serpents, and gods, but few believed they could speak. The leading scholars of the West argued that they were not words at all, only sacred symbols counting time or marking mystical concepts. The Maya in this vision were dreamers, stargazers. Without a written history, their cities remained silent. Far away in a small apartment in post-war Leningrad, a young linguist studied reproductions of those carvings. He had no great library, only fragments of books, but he saw patterns others had ignored. His name was Yuri Norisov, and he proposed something radical. He claimed the glyphs were largely phonetic signs, representing sounds of a spoken Mayan tongue. It was a brilliant idea, but Western academia dismissed him. The weight of reputation kept the silence intact. Years later, another figure stepped into the mystery. She was not a linguist, but an architect and draftswoman, Tatiana Proskuryakov. Fleeing the Russian Revolution as a child, she had built a career in careful reconstruction drawings of ancient sites. Her eye for detail was unmatched, and while examining stelae from Piedras Negras, she noticed something curious. The glyphs often appeared in groups of 3 dates, spread across the lifetime of a person. She realized the earliest must mean birth, the middle accession, the final death. The stones were not abstractions, they were biographies. Her revelation shattered the dogma. Suddenly, the kings and queens carved into stone had names and lives. The monuments were not mute decorations. They were voices telling histories of marriages, wars, and dynasties. Her insight proved Norisov right. The glyphs were indeed a script capable of recording language. With this new approach, the door burst open. A generation of scholars around the world began piecing together the political drama of the Maya world.
And you can see here,
From the silence of centuries emerged stories of rival kingdoms, of alliances sealed with weddings, of betrayals carved in stone, of victories celebrated with blood sacrifice. Each monument that had once seemed a riddle now read like a page from history. The cities were not only places of ritual, they were arenas of ambition and power. The Maya kings and queens were no longer shadows. They became people with triumphs and failures, their lives etched into the walls of temples. The decipherment was one of the great intellectual victories of the modern era, and with it the silent cities finally spoke in their own words. What emerged was not the image of a gentle mystical people, but a civilization of fierce rulers, brilliant scholars, and complex societies. The mystery of their fall remained, but their voices were restored. With the voices of the stones unlocked, a fuller portrait of the Maya world began to take shape. What had once been imagined as a realm of priests gazing at the stars became a stage of political drama. Families of kings ruled for generations, forging alliances through marriage and cementing power with displays of grandeur. The glyphs named them and placed them within long dynasties, each ruler inheriting not just a throne, but a cosmic duty. The story told by these inscriptions revealed a landscape alive with competition. Each city sought dominance, sometimes through alliances sealed with sacred unions, sometimes through war. When those ties broke, apart from grand battles there were also raids, ritual conflicts, where noble captives were paraded before the people to prove the might of a rival dynasty. For the Maya, warfare was not always about conquest of land. It was about prestige, the capture of kings and lords to be sacrificed before the spirit. Gods. The blood of these captives became part of the sacred bargain that kept the universe in balance. Art and architecture mirrored this relentless contest. Temples grew taller, palaces wider, ball courts larger. The limestone facades gleamed under layers of brilliant plaster. Each monument shouted the power of a king who wished to outshine his rival. Every new temple demanded more labor and more forest cut for lime and timber. Rivalry turned into an arms race of architecture, each city trying to declare itself eternal through stone. At the height of their world in the 8th century, the population swelled. Cities like Tikal may have been home to tens of thousands, feeding on maize harvested from fields carved out of the rainforest. The burden on the land grew immense. Yet, from within their plazas, the Maya seemed invincible. The calendars turned, the rituals continued, the armies marched, and the kings bled into bark paper to keep the heavens steady. The belief in the order of the cosmos was unwavering. But beneath the grandeur, the strain was mounting. The wars became more frequent, and the monuments grew more desperate in tone. The sacred cycle that had carried them for centuries began to falter. Without rain, the reservoirs cracked. Without stability, the trade routes frayed. The confidence that had built towers above the jungle canopy was about to unravel. Into this fragile world, the sky would turn silent, and the age of abundance would slide into an age of collapse. In the final centuries of the Classic Age, the weight of ambition bore down on every stone laid in the jungle. The kings who claimed divine power could not slow their competition. They sought to outshine one another with monuments higher than suspension, before plastered with gleaming white stucco that demanded entire forests to fuel the fires for lime kilns. Every pyramid was not just an offering to the gods, but a statement of supremacy to rival kings. Each block carried within it the hidden cost of acres of trees felled, animals driven away, soil stripped bare. Archaeologists reading the landscape see how the land itself suffered. Hills once clothed in dense jungle turned to patches of exhausted fields. Rivers clogged with eroded earth. Lakes filled with silt as seasonal rains carried away the topsoil. Without the binding roots of trees, the ground grew fragile. Each storm tore away more fertility, leaving behind thin layers that could no longer sustain crops. The very act of creating cities of splendor undermined the foundation on which those cities stood. The people still clung to the cycle of maize, but the yields began to falter. Hunger crept into the plazas, where festivals had once offered abundance. Trade routes that had delivered obsidian salt and precious jade became dangerous as warlords seized control. In some places, evidence shows ordinary families moving into abandoned palaces, lighting, cooking fires on plaster floors, turning the houses of kings into shelters for survival. The art carved on stelae shifts to reflect a darker world. No longer serene rulers communing with gods, but warriors armoured in jaguar skins. Warriors painted for death, leading captives bound and bloodied. The lines are harsher. The symmetry, broken, a mirror of a society strained and afraid. The murals of Bonampak scream of agony. The silence of captives broken only in paint as their nails are torn and their faces contorted. The rituals of sacrifice, once controlled and symbolic, became spectacles of desperation. The collapse was not uniform. While southern strongholds like Tikal, Palenque and Copan declined, northern centers such as Chichen Itza began to rise. Their resilience was born of adaptation, new trade routes by sea, new ways of sustaining agriculture. In the south, however, the unravelling was unstoppable. The covenant of maize and blood, the foundation of belief and politics, could not withstand the grinding weight of war, famine, and ecological ruin. From the distance of centuries it seems inevitable, but for those who lived it, each day was a slow erosion of faith. Fields, barren children, hungry kings, unable to command the rain. The sacred order faltered, and when the heavens remained silent, the people turned away from the gods and the kings alike. The unravelling of the southern cities deepened until the plazas that had once been crowded with festivals and became hollow shells of their former selves. The kings bled in vain beneath temple flames, promising that rain would return, but the sky remained indifferent. The trust that bound ruler and people cracked. When the covenant failed, there was nothing left to hold the fabric together. Families began to slip away, not in riots, but in quiet resignation. Ancestral homes were abandoned, tools laid aside, half-finished monuments, and remained as testaments to hope that had run out. Entire districts stood empty as people chose survival over loyalty. Archaeologists find unfinished staircases, temples, half-built causeways that end abruptly as though masons had dropped their stones and never returned. The wars only worsened the exodus. With each battlefields lay untended and trade routes grew more perilous. Soldiers conscripted from villages left crops to rot. Merchants dared not travel for fear of ambush. Hunger became a companion in every home. The silence that replaced the chants of priests was not sudden but relentless, a tide that could not be reversed. For some, the solution was flight. Into the jungle, they carried what few possessions remained: a grinding stone, a pot, a bundle of maize seed. They melted into smaller settlements, scattered and hidden where the soil was still kind enough to give a harvest. In these places, culture endured in whispers. Language survived at the hearth. Stories of gods and ancestors lived on, even as the great cities turned to ruins. When the people departed, the jungle crept forward. Each year added another layer of green. Each decade brought the collapse of more temples, until the towers that had once risen like mountains were disguised as forested hills. The howler, the monkey replaced the voice of kings, and the insects filled the air where chants and drums had echoed. The end was not a blaze of conquest, but the slow fading of human presence, a retreat from glory to endurance. Yet even as the southern heartlands emptied, the Maya story did not end. The center of power shifted northward. Across the dry plains of the Yucatan, new cities grew. Their plazas were not yet abandoned. Their gods still received blood and smoke. Their merchants sailed along the coasts, building a new network of power. The silence of the south gave way to a final flowering in the north. In the northern lands, where the forest opened into dry plains and limestone ridges, the Maya world drew breath once more. Here, new cities rose with a vigor that contrasted the silence of the abandoned southern capitals. Chichen Itza stood at the center of this revival. Its broad avenues and colossal temples proclaimed that the spirit of the people had not been extinguished, but transformed. The architecture here echoed the traditions of the past, yet bore the marks of fresh ideas, flowing in from distant regions. The feathered serpent Kukulkan became the emblem of this northern age. A god of power and transformation, his image coiled down the sides of pyramids as shadows at the equinox traced the form of his body. The temple, now called El Castillo, rose above the city, not just as a shrine, but as a calendar in stone. Each step, each platform, aligned with the rhythm of sun and season. It was both monument and cosmic machine. Life in Chichen Itza blended the sacred and the worldly. Merchants carried salt, honey, obsidian, and cotton in dugout canoes along the coast, creating a maritime trade that reached across the Caribbean. Warriors guarded these networks and filled the great ball court with games that echoed the struggles of gods themselves. Artisans carved columns of warriors and painted murals of battles and markets, revealing a society that had turned outward, linking itself with cultures of central Mexico and beyond. The northern cities thrived for centuries after the south had fallen. Their resilience came from adaptation. Instead of clinging to the fragile model of rain and fed farming alone, they wove a web of trade that could support them in times of scarcity. They were cosmopolitan centers where influences mingled, yet their heart remained Maya. The language, the rituals, the reverence for maize, and the cycles of time endured even as new forms of power rose. Eventually, even this flowering began to wane. The same forces of rivalry, shifting alliances, and the long shadow of Spanish conquest would reshape the land. But the story of the North shows that collapse was not extinction, it was transformation. The Maya adapted, moving from towering capitals to resilient villages, carrying their identity into every new age. Today, millions still speak the languages born in those plazas. They weave patterns that carry sacred symbols. They honor the maize and the land. The silent cities may have fallen, but the people never vanished. Their endurance is the final chapter, a reminder that while monuments crumble, culture survives. The rise of the northern cities could not erase the scars of the past, but it demonstrated the resilience of the Maya spirit. Chichen Itza, with its grand temples and its ball court, larger than any other, was more than a political capital. There was a beacon drawing pilgrims, merchants, and emissaries from across the region. Its plazas thrummed with voices speaking different tongues, its markets filled with goods from mountains, forests, and seas. Here the Maya proved that they could adapt, shifting from fragile reliance on rain-fed fields to the security of wide-ranging trade routes. The architecture proclaimed ambition, not only in size but in symbolism. The Temple of Warriors, lined with endless columns carved into the likeness of armed men, was both shrine and show of might. The sacred cenotes, deep wells, believed to be portals to the underworld, became places of offerings. Objects of gold, jade, and even human sacrifices were cast into their depths as pleas to the gods of rain and fertility. The city merged commerce with ritual, weaving survival into faith. But even in this age of brilliance, tensions simmered. Rival factions struggled for control within Chichen Itza itself. Alliances shifted between coastal towns and inland powers. The resilience of the northern cities gave them centuries of life beyond their southern cousins, yet no order was eternal. Eventually, their dominance waned, and the Spanish arrival centuries later delivered brutal conquest. Still, the legacy of this northern flowering stands as proof that collapse in one place did not mean extinction everywhere. To the modern eye, the survival of the Maya people themselves is the most remarkable thread. Through centuries of upheaval they endured by retreating from vast urban centres into smaller communities, more sustainable for the land they held, fast to their languages, their weaving, their rituals, blending them at times with the faith imposed by conquerors, but never abandoning the essence of their culture. The story of the Maya is therefore not one of disappearance, but of transformation. When we look upon the green hills that conceal pyramids, we see not tombs of a vanished race, but abandoned capitals of a people who chose survival. The echo of their resilience carries forward, reminding us that identity can live on even when stone falls and empires fade. The decipherment of the script turned what had been ruins into archives of living history. Once the glyphs were understood, the cities began to speak with unexpected clarity. The stelae that lined plazas told of marriages that sealed, alliances of wars fought with ferocity, of kings who rose in triumph and fell in disgrace. The carved blocks of Copan, Tikal, and Palenque became chronicles, not of myth alone, but of politics, strategy, and human ambition. Through these voices, the Maya world gained a human face. The kings were no longer anonymous figures in feathered headdresses. They were men with names, dates of birth, ascensions, and deaths. Their reigns could be traced year by year. The murals and inscriptions that had once seemed mysterious patterns revealed episodes of capture, humiliation, and sacrifice that shook entire regions. The grandeur of the civilization was undeniable, but so too was its turbulence. The discovery reshaped the way the world saw the Maya. No longer were they portrayed as a peaceful people, obsessed only with stars and seasons. They were revealed as complex and dynamic rivals of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and masters of science, art, and war. The silence that had lasted for centuries gave way to stories filled with conflict, resilience, and brilliance. Yet the decipherment also gave weight to the tragedy of their collapse. When the last dated monuments ceased, the break in continuity was stark. It was not just the abandonment of stone, it was the end of voices. The record of their world ended, mid-sentence, as though a great library had been burned. The deciphered glyphs, let us hear them again, but only up to that point. Beyond it lies only silence, filled by speculation of why the covenant of gods and kings dissolved. For the modern world, the lessons are sharp. The Maya showed how human ingenuity can reach dazzling heights, and yet how ambition and belief in control over nature can drive a society toward fragility. They remind us that the earth has limits, and that cycles of climate cannot be commanded by ritual, that even the grandest monuments cannot hold back famine and drought. Their story is a mirror, and in that reflection, we see both caution and hope. Because the Maya did not vanish, their descendants still walk the same lands, still weave the same patterns, still speak the languages carved on those stones. The legacy of collapse is balanced by the legacy of survival. Their endurance tells to us that while cities can fall, people endure and adapt. The silence that followed the collapse was not the silence of extinction, but of change. For generations, the descendants of the Maya lived in villages scattered through the forests and highlands. They no longer raised towering pyramids or carved endless stelae. But they preserved the rhythm of their ancestors in other ways. Language endured across dozens of dialects, each one carrying echoes of the glyphs that once adorned temple walls. Women continued to weave cloth heavy, with patterns that bore symbolic meanings handed down for centuries. Every design was a text in thread, a quiet proclamation of identity. In the highlands of Guatemala and the villages of the Yucatan, ceremonies survived in adapted forms. The old gods of maize and rain were still invoked, but often side by side with saints of the Catholic faith brought by conquerors. The fusion, it was not surrender but survival. It allowed traditions to live beneath the eyes of foreign rulers while ensuring that the sacred bond between people and land never broke. The memory of the great cities did not vanish among the people themselves. They told stories of ancestors who built mountains of stone, of gods who demanded offerings of blood, of times when kings communed with the heavens. These oral traditions kept alive what stone could not. Though the outside world believed the Maya gone, their descendants carried the truth in language, ritual, and daily life. When archaeologists finally returned to the ruins with new methods, they did not find a vanished race. They found abandoned capitals of a culture that had never died. The towering pyramids were not tombs, but reminders that societies can change form without ceasing to exist. The resilience of the Maya people became the final and perhaps most powerful chapter of the story. For the modern world, the legacy is double-edged. The collapse warns of the fragility of ambition and the cost of exhausting the land. Yet the survival of the people offers hope that identity can endure through adaptation. What remains is not only stone swallowed by jungle, but a living heritage carried by millions who still speak Mayan languages, still weave the sacred patterns, still honor the maize that sustained their ancestors. The story of the Maya is not only a tale of cities gone silent, but of voices that never ceased to speak. In the centuries after the cities emptied, the forest grew over plazas and pyramids, but the pulse of the people never stopped. In hidden villages far from the abandoned capitals, daily life carried on maize, still anchored the diet prayers. They were still whispered to the spirits of rain and earth, and the languages of the ancestors continued to be spoken around hearth fires. The monumental grandeur was gone, yet the essence of culture remained alive and stubborn. The outside world did not see this continuity. To European eyes, the ruins discovered by Stevens and Catherwood seemed to belong to a people long vanished. Scholars debated whether foreigners from distant continents had built them. They ignored the living descendants who still farmed the same land and spoke the same words. The silence of the stones was mistaken for the silence of a people, but that was never the truth. In time, the decipherment of the script revealed what the people had always known, that their ancestors had built and ruled the great cities, that their bloodline and culture had never ended. The names of ancient kings and queens carved in, the glyphs linked directly to the communities who still tilled the fields and carried traditions forward. The gulf between ruin and life narrowed as history returned to those who had been written out of it. The resilience of the Maya has carried through centuries of conquest, colonization, and upheaval. Even under Spanish rule, when temples were toppled and idols destroyed, the heart of the culture bent without breaking. Rituals adapted. Words shifted. Saints replaced gods in public, while the old spirits continued to receive offerings in private. The weaving of cloth, the telling of stories, the planting of maize, all became vessels of memory, each act a refusal to vanish. Today, the living presence of the Maya is undeniable. Millions speak Mayan languages. Hundreds of villages preserve customs that can be traced back through countless generations. The ruins are no longer silent relics, but part of a continuum, connecting past to present. To stand before the overgrown steps of a pyramid is not to mourn a vanished civilization, but to recognize a living culture whose people endured by transforming. Their survival is the strongest answer to the riddle of the silent cities. The echoes of the Maya world reach across time, not only in stone, but in the lessons their story carries. The collapse of their great cities was not the act of a single enemy, but the convergence of many forces. Widespread war drained their air, strength. Environmental destruction stripped away the foundation of their fields. And when the skies withheld rain, the covenant between king and people snapped. The result was a slow dispersal, a retreat from grandeur into survival. To study their fate is to confront the fragility of all civilizations. The Maya believed their rituals could bend the natural world, yet the cycles of climate proved otherwise. They built monuments of breathtaking ambition, yet those very projects consumed the forests that sustained them. Their mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and art could not shield them from the consequences of overreach. The silent plazas remind us that even brilliance can falter when balance is lost. But their story is not only caution, it is also resilience. After abandoning the great southern capitals, the Maya endured in smaller communities. They adapted their practices, preserved their languages, and wove their memory into every fabric and prayer. Centuries of conquest and colonization did not erase them. The people who live in Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico today are living proof that collapse is not extinction. For the modern world, the mirror is clear. The challenges of resource depletion, climate instability, and political division are not confined to the past. The Maya show us how interconnected crises can magnify one another, turning strength into vulnerability. Yet they also show that survival is possible through adaptation. Their story warns and inspires in equal measure. To walk among the ruined cities is to feel both awe and humility. Awe at the heights a civilization can reach. Humility at the realization that permanence is an illusion. The stones whisper not only of what was lost, but of what endures. For in the voices of the descendants, in their languages, in their rituals, in their stubborn survival, the Maya still speak. The image of the silent cities endures because it is layered with both wonder and sorrow. Walking through the jungle, one might see a hill and realize it is not a hill at all, but a pyramid, overgrown with roots. What was once a ceremonial part for thousands now echoes only with the call of birds. The silence is haunting, yet it is also full of meaning, for it speaks of a people who once bent stone to their will, and then let it go. Archaeologists describe the collapse as a perfect storm. War became endless, draining food and faith. Deforestation stripped the land until the earth itself grew thin. Drought struck with a cruelty that lasted generations. Each crisis fed the blazes. Next, creating a spiral from which the kings could not escape. The gods did not answer the rituals. The reservoirs dried. The covenant failed. The people walked away. Yet they walked not into oblivion, but into endurance. Imagine a family in the final years of Tikal. The maize fields yield little. The reservoirs are cracked basins. The king calls for sacrifice, but hope has withered more than the crops. At night, the family gathers their few possessions. The glance once at the temple rising above them, a place where their ancestors once danced and prayed. Then they turn and step into the jungle. Their footsteps are joined by many others, until the city that had been a beacon for centuries becomes hollow stone wrapped in vines. Centuries later, when explorers cut their way through the thickets and found these ruins, they did not hear the sound of departure, only the hush of abandonment. To them, it was as if the people had disappeared. But in truth, Those families had carried the culture with them into the hills and valleys, where it lived on in smaller, quieter forms. The story of the Maya is a meditation on impermanence. Greatness can fade, yet identity can persist. Stone can crumble, yet language and ritual can outlast empires. The silent cities are not graves. They are reminders that the measure of a people is not only in the monuments they leave behind, but in the ability to adapt when the world changes around them. The fall of the classic cities marked the end of one chapter, but the Maya story continued in unexpected ways. In the north, across the drier plains of the Yucatan, new centers flourished, even as the southern lowlands turned quiet. Chichen Itza became the most renowned, a city where merchants, sailors, and warriors created a culture both familiar and transformed. The Great Pyramid that dominates its heart was more than stone. It was a living calendar. At the equinox, the shadow of a serpent slithered down its stairway, a cosmic spectacle linking earth and sky. The Temple of the Warriors flanked by hundreds of carved columns showed the power of an elite class that tied battle and belief together. The largest ball court in the ancient Americas echoed with games that symbolized both sport and ritual sacrifice. Every stone of Chichen Itza declared continuity and change. Unlike the isolated kingdoms of the south, the northern world reached outward. They built seafaring canoes that traveled the coasts, linking markets with distant lands. Salt, honey, cotton, obsidian, and cacao flowed across the Caribbean, bringing wealth that no single harvest could guarantee. This maritime network made their society more resilient when rains failed. Their adaptability became their strength. Yet even in this flowering, the shadow of instability remained. Rival factions within Chichen Itza struggled for dominance. Neighbouring cities rose and fell with shifting alliances. The resilience of the north gave the Maya centuries more of influence, but nothing lasted forever. By the time foreign conquerors arrived, the brilliance of the northern cities had dimmed. Their temples still stood, but their political power had fractured. Still the people endured. They retreated once more into villages smaller and more sustainable, just as their ancestors had done in the south. They carried their traditions through the storms of conquest. They blended their rituals with new faiths, but never abandoned the heart of their culture. Chichen Itza and its neighbours became ruins, yet the people who built them remained alive in language, memory, and ritual. To look upon the pyramid today is to see not only stone but survival. It speaks of a civilization that refused to vanish, adapting time and again. The silent cities remind us that endings can also be transformations. The northern renaissance of the Maya was a reminder that decline is rarely final. Chichen Itza stood not as a ghost of the past, but as proof of adaptation. Its temples bore the familiar patterns of their ancestors, yet their art carried new influences from faraway cultures. Warriors and merchants shaped its spirit as much as priests and astronomers. The people had learned that survival meant flexibility. Life in the city pulsed with both grandeur and pragmatism. The ball court was not only an arena for ritualized struggle, but also a stage for diplomacy, where victories and losses spoke louder than treaties. The sacred cenotes were portals of prayer, into which gold, jade, and even human lives were cast as offerings to unseen powers. Merchants thronged the plazas, bringing goods from across the peninsula. Their voices mixed with foreign tongues, proof that the Maya world was no longer isolated, but a crossroads of exchange. Even as Chichen Itza thrived, other centres emerged: Uxmal, with its intricate facades, and Mayapan, with its fortified walls. Each city bore its own identity, yet all shared the same foundation of maize, trade, and ritual. The landscape of the Yucatan became a mosaic of power centers linked by sea routes and roads, rather than dominated by a single capital. This diversity gave strength, but also bred rivalries that would eventually weaken them. The people adapted by turning outward. Their dugout canoes glided across turquoise waters, carrying salt, obsidian, and cacao to distant shores. The sea became both highway and lifeline, an innovation that cushioned them against the famines that had devastated their southern cousins. Their resilience allowed them to flourish for generations. Yet no society is immune to change. Internal divisions, foreign pressures, and the passage of time all took their toll. Northern cities eventually dimmed, and the cycle turned once more. Still, the Maya endured. They let the grand capitals fall silent when they no longer served survival, but they did not let go of their identity. In language, ritual, and community, they carried the flame forward. The ruins that dot the Yucatan today are not tombs of a vanished people, but reminders that a culture can outlive its monuments. In the endurance of the Maya, we find the true legacy of the silent cities, not disappearance, but transformation. The story of the Maya does not end with the silence of their cities or the rise of new ones in the north. It stretches into the lives of their descendants, who carried their culture through centuries of change. The Spanish conquest brought devastation, burning temples, toppling idols, and attempting to erase old ways. Yet even under the weight of foreign rule, the heart of Maya identity endured. In hidden villages, rituals continued in forms that blended new and old. Saints shared space with ancient gods. Maize remained sacred, its planting and harvest marked with prayers that echoed those spoken in classic times. Women at their looms wove patterns heavy with symbolism, each thread preserving myths and histories that no conqueror could destroy. Language survived in dozens of dialects, a living echo of the glyphs once carved in stone. Families told stories of ancestors who built mountains of stone, and of gods who demanded offerings, keeping alive memories that reached across centuries. Archaeologists and explorers often mistook the ruins as signs of extinction, but the living Maya disproved that idea. Their survival was not loud or monumental, but persistent, like the growth of roots beneath the forest floor. They endured drought, famine, war, and conquest, not by clinging to grandeur, but by adapting, by shifting from empires to villages, from stone capitals to human memory. Modern scholars now recognize that the true legacy of the Maya is not only in their pyramids or their writing, but in the millions of people who continue to live, speak, and create in their tradition. To walk through a village in the Yucatan or the highlands of Guatemala is to see children learning Mayan languages, to watch women weaving designs unchanged for centuries, to hear prayers that tie present life to ancient belief. The ruins are reminders of past brilliance, but the reminders and formant five past brilliance, people themselves are proof that culture can bend without breaking. The silent cities remain a haunting lesson of fragility and ambition, but the living Maya offer the other half of the story. They show that collapse is not the same as death, and that identity can survive even when monuments crumble. Their endurance is the most powerful testament of all. The mystery of the silent cities continues to stir the imagination because it is both a warning and a story of resilience. For centuries, scholars searched for a single cause of collapse, hoping for one clear answer. But the evidence now paints a more complex picture. The end of the Classic Age was not brought about by a lone disaster, but by a chain of crises. Each amplifying the other, war stripped the land of security. Deforestation eroded the soil. Drought turned the sky into a source of despair. Together they created a spiral too powerful to escape. The lesson resonates far beyond the Maya world. A civilization at its height may believe itself eternal. Its cities rise higher each year. Its leaders proclaim divine authority. Its knowledge of the heavens seems unmatched. Yet greatness can carry within it the seeds of fragility. The very drive to build larger temples and to feed swelling populations demanded more from the land than it could give. The belief that kings could command the rain blinded people to the limits of their environment. When the sky grew silent, there was no margin left. And yet from that silence came endurance. The Maya people chose survival over ruin. They abandoned cities not because they were weak, but because they were wise enough to walk away from what could no longer sustain them. By retreating into smaller villages, by adapting rituals and trade, they ensured that their culture lived on. The monuments fell quiet, but the people themselves continued. This act of resilience is as important as the grandeur that came before. For us, their story is a mirror. It asks how we treat the earth that sustains us, how we prepare for changes we cannot command, and how we balance ambition with respect for the limits of our world. The Maya remind us that collapse can be slow, a fading of confidence, a silence spreading across plazas until only the jungle remains. They remind us too that survival is possible if adaptation is embraced. To stand among the ruins is to feel both humility and hope. Humility at the fragility of human achievement, hope at the endurance of culture. The cities may be silent, but the voices of their descendants still speak, carrying the story forward into the present. The silence of the ancient plazas is heavy with meaning because it is not only about loss, but about continuity. Every block of stone, overgrown with vines, is a reminder of both brilliance and impermanence. The Maya created a world of process, mathematics, astronomy, art and ritual that rivaled any of the great civilizations of history. They charted the heavens, they conceived of zero, they aligned their temples with the stars, yet none of this shielded them from the consequences of exhausting their environment and from the long shadow of drought. When the sky withheld rain, the great covenant unraveled. Kings who had promised divine power could not deliver. Maize shriveled and families left their homes. The people turned their backs on the temples, not out of ignorance, but out of a necessity. They sought life in smaller settlements where the land still gave harvests. In this way, the collapse of the cities was not a disappearance, but a decision and a collective choice to survive by walking away. Centuries later, when scholars deciphered the glyphs, the stones began to speak once more. The rulers who had been silent now revealed their names, their triumphs, their defeats. The monuments no longer stood only as ruins, but as voices from the skeeve, past telling stories of dynasties and wars. The decipherment restored humanity to the carvings, showing the Maya not as mysterious dreamers, but as real people living through ambition and struggle. In the modern world, the Maya story continues to resonate. It is at once a cautionary tale about the limits of growth and a testament to resilience. The lesson is stark. A civilization can reach dazzling heights and still falter when it pushes, beyond the balance of its environment. But the other lesson is equally powerful. Collapse need not mean the end. The Maya people did not vanish. They adapted. They preserved their languages and traditions. They survived conquest and colonization and still live across Central America today. The ruins are silent, but the culture is not. The story they tell is not only about what was lost, but about what endures. The silent cities remind us that History is never just about endings. It is also about transformations that carry forward through generations. The story of the Maya closes not with disappearance, but with survival. The silent pyramids rise above the jungle, yet the people whose ancestors built them remain. The great cities may be wrapped in vines, their plazas hushed, their murals faded, but in villages across Central America, life carries the thread forward. Millions still speak Mayan languages, still plant maize with rituals tied to ancient belief, still weave patterns that encode stories of gods and creation. Their presence is the most powerful answer to the question of collapse. For centuries, outsiders misread the ruins, believing them to be relics of a lost people. In truth, they were abandoned capitals, not graves. The Maya endured by adapting, retreating from vast urban centres into smaller communities that could live in balance with the land. They chose survival over grandeur, transformation over extinction. The monuments testify to ambition and to fragility, but the people themselves are living monuments to endurance. The decipherment of the glyphs gave the ancient Maya a voice again, but it also gave modern descendants a bridge to their history. They were no longer framed as a vanished race, but as heirs to a civilization of remarkable complexity. Scholars now read the stones, not only for academic knowledge, but as documents of identity. Each inscription reconnects the living to their ancestors. Each translation affirms that the silence was never absolute. The lessons echo across time. Civilizations can dazzle the world with their achievements, and yet undermine themselves when ambition outpaces sustainability. The Maya remind us that climate, political rivalry, and human choices intertwine. Their collapse was not sudden but cumulative, a slow unraveling of a system stretched too far. Yet even in collapse, there is resilience. Even in silence, there is continuity. To stand before the green-covered pyramids is to confront both warning and hope. The warning is clear. No civilization, however brilliant, is immune to the limits of its environment. The hope is equally clear. A culture can survive even when its cities fall. The Maya endure not in stone but in people. In their voices, in their prayers, in their determination to carry memory forward, the ancient world still speaks.